Yesterday, I began my program by saying that there were conflicting reports about a Ukrainian counterattack in Bakhmut. I said that I thought that whilst there might have been some kind of a Ukrainian counterattack, it was most unlikely that it had achieved anything of any significance, and if it did take place and did capture some ground, almost certainly that ground would be recovered by the Russians very quickly, and that the direction of travel in the battle in Bakhmut pointed to continued Russian advances. Well, today we have confirmation of that from a curious source, and the source in question is the British Ministry of Defence, which has provided an update about the fighting in Bakhmut, which is very pessimistic from a Ukrainian point of view. I'm going to read briefly what it says. It's always short. Russia has re-energized its assault on the Donetsk Oblast town of Bakhmut as forces of the Russian Ministry of Defense and Wagner Group have improved cooperation. The Ukrainian defense still holds the western districts of the town, but has been subjected to particularly intense Russian artillery fire over the previous 48 hours. Wagner assault troops continue to conduct the main advance through the centre of town, whilst Russian airborne forces have relieved some Wagner units, securing the northern and southern flanks of the operation. Well, Prigozhin, of course, has already told us all of that. And then it finishes, Ukrainian forces face significant resupply issues, but have made orderly withdrawals from the positions they have been forced to concede. So the latter is essentially an admission that the Ukrainians are in retreat, that they're in fact retreating in Bakhmut, that they are not advancing. And obviously the British Ministry of Defence is always going to give an optimistic spin, but the only optimistic spin it can provide is that the advances by the Russians are contested and that Ukrainian withdrawals are now orderly. Notice that the dispatch from the British Ministry of Defence appears to accept that the Russians are in control of central Bakhmut. It talks about the Ukrainian troops retreating to western Bakhmut, and it also now admits that the Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut are now facing supply problems. Well, that is the British Ministry of Defence. Slavyangrad has provided us with an account of the fighting from the Russian point of view, from a channel or a group called Nabrezhne Intel. I don't pretend I know them very well, but it does seem to be accurate. And as I said, Slavyangrad is a reliable site, in my experience, and is a very effective site aggregator site, but it's over and above the reporting and commentary and analysis it regularly provides. Anyway, this is what Nabrezhne Intel tells us about the situation. As of 12 noon local time on the 14th of April, in other words today, in the Khromovsky district of Bakhmut, continual advances by the Wagner Group are now putting the remaining viable road of the Ukrainian forces at risk. Now, this is clearly the road that passes through Khromovo. There is a map attached to this article. I should say that it's not so much a map as a satellite picture, but it gives you fairly good indication of where the front lines are. But anyway, it shows what appears to be a sign of Khromovo, slightly to the northwest of what is still Ukrainian-controlled territory, but it also shows continued Russian advances into a district of Bakhmut, which I presume is the Khromovsky district, obviously connected with Khromovo. And clearly what is referred to here, as I said, is the road that passes through Khromovo. And then the article goes on to say, Wagner have advanced, reaching the outskirts of the hospital, obviously an important structure, not one I know much about. And as I said, I'm not good at examining satellite pictures and maps. My eyesight makes that very difficult for me. But anyway, Wagner have advanced, reaching the outskirts of the hospital, and now pushing deeper and deeper in the center of the western residential area. And then it goes on to say, nearby to train station 2, paratroopers, Russian paratroopers, supported by the Wagner group, continue to expand the zone of control in and around the area. They are pushing along the Prov-Tchaikovskaya Street, which is squeezing out Ukrainian forces who are defending opposite the train station. Nearby to the train station, nearby to train station 1, after a costly withdrawal, the Ukrainian forces are now being slightly pushed across the train station. Wagner reconnaissance groups are exploiting weaknesses in the front line and are causing havoc behind Ukrainian lines, and a small bridgehead has been formed. In the Avant-Garde district, presumably this is where the Avant-Garde Stadium is located, the situation remains tense, which I take to mean, by the way, that the Ukrainians are still successfully resisting there. However, airborne artillery, that's to say the artillery of the airborne troops, the Russian paratroopers, are grinding out the last remaining Ukrainian troops across the railway. So that's, as I said, from this group, this Russian channel, Nabrezhnye Intel, and as I said, it's been provided by Slavyangrad. And I should say that, as I said, looking at this map, which, as I said, I can't read very well, but you can see some of the structures that are described, and it's also clear that the area of Bakhmut under Ukrainian control is now very small. I'm not absolutely clear about the scale of this map, of this particular photo, but personally I'd be very surprised if the area, the circumference of the area under Ukrainian control is any longer as great as 5 kilometers. So it looks as if there might have been a Ukrainian counterattack. If there was, it's been repulsed, and on the contrary, it may have opened the way for the Russians to achieve significant advances in Bakhmut themselves. In other words, the Ukrainian counterattack may actually have weakened Ukrainian positions within Bakhmut. There's also now reports that the Russian airborne troops, the paratroopers, have taken over from the Wagner forces the fight in Ivanivska, and apparently they've made ground. They've now recovered some of the ground. There's been a lot of ebb and flow of the fighting around Ivanivska, and there was a report some time ago that Ukraine has as many as 3 brigades located in this relatively small village or outer suburb of Bakhmut. It's important because, of course, if it falls, the Russians capture it, then the southern spur of the road from Chasov Yar is cut. And I doubt that it's actually a usable road at all. In fact, to the extent that I think Ukraine is able to send reinforcements into Bakhmut, it probably does them through the northern spur at Khromovo. But anyway, the Ukrainians have tried to push Russian forces back from Ivanivska, Krasnoye, as the Russians call it. The Russians have pushed back, and at the moment, again, the airborne troops have the ascendancy in the fighting in Ivanivska. And I even saw a report, which I'm going to take with a huge cascade of salt, in light of what Slavyangrad said about the fact that one shouldn't take claims about the high ground in this part of the battlefield at all seriously. But I saw a report which said that the Russian paratroopers have actually captured some higher ground, let's call it that, higher ground near Ivanivska, and that they're able, that's improved their positions, that they can now look down over the village, or at least they can to some extent. So, bad news for the Ukrainians in Bakhmut. It's now clear that they are being steadily pushed back. And it's also clear that the roads remain extremely difficult for Ukraine to use. And we see that the British Ministry of Defence has now admitted that the Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut are suffering severe supply problems. Now, yesterday, Yan Gagin, I think it was, said that he thought it most unlikely that the Ukrainians could retreat their group in Bakhmut, that they couldn't really pull it back, that if they tried to pull back through the gap which remains between the two Russian pincers, they would be caught in a crossfire of Russian artillery, and that they would suffer enormously heavy losses. And, well, I'm not going to try and guess how many would get through, but clearly there would be severe losses in any attempt to do that. And I have to say that the bulletin from the British Ministry of Defence, it seems to me, seems to be saying much the same thing. It may talk about an organised Ukrainian retreat to positions in western Bakhmut, but how can these forces in western Bakhmut, these Ukrainian forces, retreat out of the town now if, as the British Ministry of Defence admits, Ukraine isn't able to keep them fully supplied? It would mean that they would have to pass down these contested roads. Even the British Ministry of Defence, by implication, admits that these are now contested roads. And as I said, there would be very heavy shelling and lots of losses. And of course, if they try to cross over the open fields and the country lanes, well, I think the losses would be just as bad, because I think that trying to retreat cross-country under the fire of the guns would be an extremely reckless thing to do, to put it mildly. And I'm going to add, by the way, that such a retreat, again, I'm not a military person, but I'm not sure how organised it would be if it were conducted across the fields. And the remaining area of Bakhmut under Ukrainian control makes it very difficult for me to see how you could establish an effective rearguard in this rather limited area of territory. And of course, if all the troops in Bakhmut, the Ukrainian troops, did try to escape west, given the difficulties of setting up a rearguard, the Russians would be there on their tail. So I have to say I'm starting to come round to Gagin's view from yesterday. Now, I say all of that, I'm not a military man, as I've said so many times. What I know about war, I've largely learnt over the last year. People who understand these things better than me are welcome to come back, argue or point out where I'm wrong, and explain how an organised withdrawal from Bakhmut by the Ukrainian forces is indeed possible. My own sense, however, is that the opportunity to do that, the time to do that, has now passed, and that these Ukrainian troops still in Bakhmut are now in an extremely difficult position indeed. And it also looks, by the way, as if the prospects of the great Ukrainian counterattack to relieve Bakhmut, to push the Russians back, to hold on to Bakhmut, to encircle the Russian forces in Bakhmut, to achieve a second Stalingrad, but this time are the Russians in Bakhmut. Well, all of that, the prospects of that, are now receding to the point of disappearance. Again, that's my assessment today. I mean, I might be wrong. But anyway, that's the fighting in Bakhmut. Before I leave the topic of the fighting in Bakhmut, I should say that Prigozhin has now come up with some casualty figures of what he thinks are Ukrainian losses in Bakhmut. He puts them at over 30,000 Ukrainian soldiers killed in Bakhmut. Now, that isn't over over a short period of weeks. We're talking about the battle as it's been fought since the summer. I have no way of verifying Prigozhin's figures. I don't know how he arrives at these figures. I presume when he talks about Bakhmut, he doesn't just mean Bakhmut, he means Soledar, Opitnoye, Krasnaya Gora, Paraskovievka, all of these other places that form a part of the battle. And he also, however, does say that by far the heaviest losses Ukraine has suffered in Bakhmut have been experienced over the last few months, probably since January. And anyway, as I said, I'm not going to argue or discuss or debate Prigozhin's figures, but even Western sources have admitted that Ukraine has paid an extraordinarily high cost for its defense of Bakhmut. I'm just going to add here one further point about the fighting in Bakhmut. People talk about it having gone on for 10 months or whatever, but in practice, the real Russian offensive against Bakhmut began in late November. The Russians were pushing towards Bakhmut over the course of the summer. They came close to Bakhmut over the course of the summer. There's been fighting in and around Bakhmut ever since then. But the Russian offensive in Bakhmut, the conversion of Bakhmut into this meat grinder for the Ukrainian army, it only began in November, and it has intensified ever since. And I think people perhaps need to take that into account when they talk about this particular battle. One other thing, by the way, that has come from a Wagner source is they've talked about the fortifications that Ukraine created in central Bakhmut. And there were actually quite a lot of pictures and photos earlier in the fighting showing all kinds of rather makeshift fortifications that had been created by the Ukrainian troops in central Bakhmut to resist a Russian assault on the center of this town. According to this Wagner source, these fortifications were every bit as makeshift as they appeared. They apparently formed no significant obstacle. This particular Wagner source has said that Ukrainian fortifications, fortified positions in the village of Opitnoye, south of Bakhmut, one of those places which the Wagner troops had to capture before they attacked Bakhmut itself, that those fortifications actually presented more problems for the Wagner troops than did the fortifications created in Bakhmut itself. And by far the greatest problems that the Wagner troops have faced have not been these makeshift fortifications in the centre of the town, but rather the use the Ukrainians have made of the industrial facilities, places like the Azon plant and the rest, and these big apartment buildings in the residential area in the west, which I've discussed many times, and which form natural fortresses. On the topic of those apartment buildings, General Syrski, the Ukrainian ground forces commander, is now claiming that the Russians are conducting scorched earth tactics in Bakhmut. In other words, they're shelling Ukrainian positions in these apartment buildings. And the fact that General Syrski is talking in this way, I have to say, suggests to me that he too has now come to realize that the battle is ending and that a final Ukrainian defeat, a loss of Bakhmut, is looming. By the way, for the record, he said that the Russians are using the same kind of tactics in Bakhmut that they used in Syria. Well, that's what he said. I'm going to just finish by saying that I think once the Russians capture Bakhmut, they will attempt to clear up some of the places nearby. Chasov Yar, obviously, Ivanivska, if it's not been captured before Bakhmut falls, Bogdanovka, Orekhov, Vasilyevka, all of these places. And I suspect, as I said, that their next big target will be Siversk and Chasov Yar to the west. I think that there's also a fair chance that they will want to push on to Konstantinovka, which is a little distance, apparently a couple of kilometers further west from Chasov Yar. And that will leave the Russians, or so it seems to me, in a relatively strong position to launch their next offensive towards Kramatorsk and Slavyansk once the Ukrainian counteroffensive is out of the way. And that may take, of course, a couple of weeks or months. We'll just have to wait and see. Anyway, that's Bakhmut. There's also been a lot of reports about fighting in Avdiivka. Always one gets less information about what is going on in Avdiivka, but the reports that are coming from Russian channels about the fighting near Avdiivka comes across as pretty confident, and one gets a sense that the Russians are pushing hard and that they're making significant progress around this fortified town. I suspect, again, once Bakhmut and the areas around it, Chasov Yar, Seversk, Ivanivska, Bogdanovka, Orekhov, Vasilyevka, perhaps Konstantinovka, are captured, the Russian advance on Avdiivka will accelerate, and we'll see the Russians make a big effort to clear up the situation in Avdiivka as well. That will then leave the only areas of the Donbass still under Ukrainian control, significant areas, being the two important towns of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, some areas to the west of Avdiivka, including the important town of Bakrovsk, and further south, this very complex, unresolved battle in Marinka and Vugleda, where, however, the Russians also claim that they're making progress, though it's clear that they're making that the progress has been, to put it mildly, very slow. Anyway, that's where we are about the fighting in Donbass. Now, there's been a lot more discussion about the operations of the Russian Air Force, the depletion of Ukraine's air defense system. Brian Beletic has done an important video about this, and I would certainly refer to this video, and I would also, at this point, make a further comment about that video by Brian Beletic, because he starts it by responding to a tweet by the by Ukraine, the Ukrainian government of all people, complaining about Brian Beletic and about the fact that he has made certain criticisms of extreme right-wing groups in Ukraine and the policies that the Ukrainian government has followed. I want to make it absolutely clear that I think this tweet was absolutely wrong, inappropriate in every respect. I think all of Brian Beletic's comments have been factually based, and I find it bizarre that a Ukrainian government caught up in the midst of a war has nothing better to do, apparently, than to tweet and make comments like that about a person who is reporting about the war in good faith and whose commentaries, especially about the logistics situation, have proved consistently accurate, as statements by Ukrainian officials themselves have admitted. So that's what I wanted to say and about this tweet. But of course, can I just also add that Brian Beletic's latest video on the Ukrainian air defense system is worth seeing, not just for that issue, but for the topic he covers, as is his previous hour-long video discussing the Ukrainian offensive and how that's going to be conducted and all the various issues that give rise to it, that surround it. So that's what I wanted to say about the situation on the battlefields. Now, there's been a lot more discussion about the, I'm going to call it Pentagon Papers too, though it should be made very clear that this is not a document leak that in any way comes close to matching that extraordinary leak of documents that was carried out in the early 1970s by Daniel Ellsberg, which provided this enormous insight into US conduct of the war in Vietnam. This is a small group of interesting documents that have appeared and which have provided us with some insight into what is going on in the war. And there's been some rather interesting developments here. First of all, a young man, 21, guardsman, has now been arrested. He was already identified most improperly by certain media organs, the New York Times, for example, as the likely perpetrator. He's been already described as a Christian, a person who's interested in guns, all kinds of absurd things like that. Well, I know that they're absurd, but anyway, all sorts of irrelevant things, in my opinion. I mean, what has that got to do with the fact that he might, and I stress might, have provided these documents, published these documents? There's already a huge amount of speculations about whether or not he's innocent or guilty, or some kind of patsy, or anything of that kind. All I will say about that is that we have no information at the moment to develop a proper view. Firstly, about whether he was the leaker at all. Secondly, about his motives, if he was. So let's wait and see. He might have a defense to make. We should wait until he makes it. I would add one further point, however. I previously speculated that these documents might have been leaked by senior people within the Pentagon as part of the undoubted internal discussion which is certainly taking place in in the United States about the direction of the war in Ukraine, and I will come to that in a moment. There's no doubt that this discussion is indeed taking place, that there is indeed an argument about this, an ongoing argument about this going on. However, if this individual is indeed the leaker, then I want to say straight away that my guess that this was a leak that was purposefully made as part of that argument that's taking place within the US government, well, that was obviously wrong. It looks instead as if this was more the work of a young whistleblower, if the person identified really is the person who has done this thing. But as to that, as I said, we'll just have to wait and see. Now, there's been a lot more discussion about the documents themselves. There's some suggestions that the original document dump consisted of authentic documents. Some of the later documents that have appeared might not have been. There's some discussion, for example, about a particular document that claims that there are enormous dissensions within the Russian government, that various Russian officials are arguing with each other, that the FSB, I'm sure it is the FSB, Russian intelligence, is claiming that the Russian Defense Ministry is concealing numbers about casualties, and there's been reports to the effect that this somehow proves that this is a gloss from a newspaper article in the New York Times. The New York Times takes the view that this proves that the US intelligence community has thoroughly penetrated the Russian defense and intelligence establishment. Now, I'm going to say straight away that we need to go back to a point that Larry Johnson has previously made. It's simply because all kinds of information appears in classified US intelligence documents doesn't necessarily prove that it is true. All sorts of odd things can appear in documents, and I have to say that discussions about dissensions and arguments within the Russian military and political leadership, and indeed with any political and military leadership with which the United States is in conflict, intelligence assessments within the US about those kind of arguments, that is as old as the Ark. I can remember, for example, I'm just old enough to remember how there were all sorts of claims about how the North Vietnamese leadership during the Vietnam War was split. And there were all kinds of discussions and debates about, whether some of them were pro-Moscow and some of them were pro-China. I remember there was an official, I think his name was Thuong Chin, who was consistently seen as China's man within the top leadership of the Vietnamese Communist Party. And there were supposed to be all sorts of arguments and dissensions, and some were supposed to be hardliners and some were supposed to be softliners. And subsequently we've learnt that this was largely wrong. We used to get all kinds of reports and claims about arguments and dissensions that used to take place within the Soviet Politburo. And got extensive reports about this. Now, I'm not going to say that all of those reports were wrong. Some of them undoubtedly came from information provided by Soviet sources who were not necessarily engaged in spying or providing intelligence, classified intelligence, but, they would chat with diplomats, they would talk to journalists, and this would find its way back to Washington. But anyway, much of that was also, as it turns out, wrong. So this kind of thing actually is no different from that, and that there are undoubtedly arguments and quarrels going on within the Russian political leadership is unquestionably the case. It is likely to be true of any government. We know that there have been arguments between Prigozhin and the Russian Defense Ministry, and it's not difficult to guess that Prigozhin has his backers within the Russian government, and so that's already providing you with a whole narrative, if you want to build on it, about disputes and arguments within the Russian government. It doesn't follow that the entire Russian political, military and security establishment have been penetrated by the intelligence agencies of the United States. The one does not prove the other. These kind of reports should not be taken or read in that sort of way. I would add that those kind of reports, which, are, if I can put it, speculative intelligence, should be taken, should be treated with, I think, little weight should be given to them. After all, we've had plenty of reports about dissensions on the Ukrainian side. We get all these reports about arguments between General Zaluzhny and President Zelensky. They often recur. So why not arguments within the Russian side? But all we can say for a fact is that overall, the situation that we see presented to us from the Russian government to the world looks pretty solid. There's little evidence that the Russian government is having difficulty making decisions about the war at any point, and one mustn't assume that, as I said, these reports are in any way true. Now, moving on from that, however, there are some rather interesting points made in these documents about the future direction of the war. And there's some reports which suggest, amongst these documents, that the Pentagon expects this war to go on beyond this year. It doesn't expect any big Ukrainian gains as a result of Ukraine's coming offensive. It doesn't expect any big Russian territorial gains either. Though as to that, I think that will depend very much on what happens with respect to this Ukrainian counteroffensive. If the counteroffensive is defeated, then I think once Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Vuhledar and Marinka and Siversk have all fallen, then it seems to me, on the contrary, that the Russians are probably well positioned to make substantial gains in Donbass, pushing all the way west to the Dnieper River, bringing them to the heart of Ukraine, opposite the key town of Dnipro. But anyway, putting all that aside, the thing to understand is that when these reports talk about a stalemate situation in Ukraine, that is a defeat for Ukraine and for the United States. We have already seen reports going all the way back to that Rand Corporation study that appeared some months ago, that a prolonged war in Ukraine is not in US interests. US arsenals of key weapons are becoming depleted, and one report within within this document cache also talked about the fact that if there was a prolonged stalemate, Ukraine, because of its losses, would be obliged to undertake a total mobilization, which, to be very clear, would have a catastrophic effect on what is left of the Ukrainian economy. If all the men are in the army, who's going to operate the factories? Who's going to carry out economic activity? And it would also, this article, this report, this dispatch worries, it could also lead to major protests against President Zelensky personally and President Zelensky's government. Now, again, I don't know for an absolute fact that all that is true, but that's an American report. And it does seem to me that when we're talking about a stalemate, it is a stalemate in a war of attrition. And given that the Russians have waged this war as an attrition war, if we find ourselves in that kind of situation where Ukraine is only left with the choice of carrying on with a total mobilization or experiencing a military collapse, then it's clear that the war of attrition, from the Russian point of view, is working, that Ukraine and indeed its Western sponsors are being ground down, and that, in fact, military defeat is looming. Well, that might explain an article which has now appeared in Foreign Policy, which says that the United States needs to find some way to prepare for a diplomatic solution of the war. It seems to accept that a stalemate situation is not to Ukraine's long-term advantage, to put it mildly, and that in fact it would open the way for Ukraine's total defeat. Now, again, all very well talking about diplomatic solutions and those kind of things, but is it really worthwhile risking everything on this Ukrainian offensive over the next few weeks, with all the many problems it suffers from, hoping that that offensive will turn things round so that you are, and postponing your negotiations, your diplomatic moves until then? Surely, given that this is an attrition war, and given that Ukraine clearly is losing that attrition war, it makes far better sense to make that diplomatic pitch now. Well, I've been saying that for a long time. I doubt anybody in Kiev or Washington is paying any attention. It seems to me that we're going to be pressing on with this war, despite all the problems and all the risks that follow from it. Now, whilst I'm on that topic, I'm now going to return to the other aspect of that extraordinary article by Seymour Hersh, the one I discussed yesterday, in which I said yesterday that it's clear that Seymour Hersh claims that there's now a collapse of trust between the Biden administration and parts of the US intelligence and security establishment, that they are dismayed by the ideological outlook of the president and of his key advisors, and that they're finding it impossible to get these people to listen and to absorb the realities of the situation. Now, that wasn't the only thing that Seymour Hersh talked about. He also talked about an explosion of corruption in Ukraine, and in particular, rampant corruption within President Zelensky's government. According to Hersh, and this is, I'm taking all this from Hersh, President Zelensky himself is now skimming on Western aid. Some Ukrainian officials have set up companies, front companies, through which they're selling weapons and supplies supplied to Ukraine from the West. And there appears to be, according to Hersh, a substantial racket whereby President Zelensky himself and some of his key advisors are using money that they're getting from the West to buy diesel oil in Russia. Interesting to know how they are able to buy diesel oil in Russia. Perhaps they're corrupting some people in Russia. Wouldn't surprise me. But anyway, they're buying diesel oil in Russia. Allegedly, this is diesel oil which supposedly is to be used to sort out, to resolve Ukraine's own supply issues. But what Zelensky and his people are doing instead is that they're selling it to the West, and they're making, or in other places where there's a diesel oil shortages, and that they're making a large amount of money on the back of all of this. Now, I want to stress again, this is all from Seymour Hersh. I have no independent information about whether or not this is true. But it is Seymour Hersh. I have found that his story about Nord Stream is just not only plausible, but the attempt to refute it with the 6 guys and a boat claim makes me even more inclined to believe that what Seymour Hersh said is true. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if this account is true also. And interestingly, Seymour Hersh says that the United States is fully aware of all this corruption and is in effect greenlighting it. Apparently, according to Hersh again, the the CIA director, William Burns, has clearly been used by the administration as its point man in any particular crisis. He was sent to Kiev. He had a meeting with Zelensky. He told Zelensky, "You're being too greedy. You mustn't skim so much. What you're doing is you're causing dissatisfaction amongst the rest of the Ukrainian elite, who feel that you're taking a disproportionate amount of the pie. And besides, some of this corruption is now so extreme and so blatant that if it continues at this level, it will cause all kinds of political problems." And allegedly, Zelensky was handed a list of 35 officials, generals and other officials who were engaged in this corruption, but he only sacked a few of them. Well, again, I have no idea whether or not this is true, but if it is, which I think highly likely, then of course it follows the pattern of what happens in all of America's wars. It happened in Vietnam, it happened in Afghanistan, it happened in Iraq, it's happened in so many other places. Money pours into a country. That country is usually pretty dysfunctional already. That's, after all, why the US is there in the first place. Corruption explodes and gets out of control. And the United States finds that it cannot do much about this corruption, because ultimately the people who are engaging in the corruption are the only people it can rely upon to prosecute the war that it is waging. So it has to allow this corruption to continue. And of course, making the matter even worse, inevitably, some people in the US are themselves corrupted. Some people in the US were probably corrupt in the first place. And of course, they benefit from the corruption themselves. And of course, the thing gets more and more out of control. If Seymour Hersh's account is true, and as I said, I am inclined to believe it. After all, why wouldn't it be true? It's exactly the same as what has happened before. It would be further proof that nothing in these wars, America's wars, ever seems to change. They all seem to repeat themselves. They all follow identical patterns. And of course, none of them up to now have ended well. Well, that's where I'm going to finish today. There'll be more, no doubt, over the next couple of days about the events in Bakhmut and Avdiivka. And in the meantime, all that remains is to thank you for joining me once more, to wish you to wish you the best on the Orthodox Good Friday, and to say again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, Rockfin and Telegram, and that you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and go to our shop, links under this video. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon.